So in the last class, we stopped with the whole picture of the whole creation bowing down before the Lamb and worshipping the Lamb. And we saw the exaltation passage where the whole creation crying out to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb, he praise and glory and honor and power forever and ever. So we have that picture of adoration. We have that picture of glorification, and we have that a sense of worship that we can find over there. And to kind of symbolize that, it also says that the four living creatures, symbolizing the whole creation, and the elders, again representing God's people. We have already spoken about the 24 elders, kind of representing the tribes of Israel as well as the people of God, like a representation of the apostles, the 12 apostles, falling down and worshiping the King of Kings. So this picture is pretty clear as we can see. Now, from chapter 6 onwards until chapter 16, we are going to see, the different aspects of God's judgment upon the wicked. Now, obviously, it is written in the form, especially in the first section, which is what we are doing today, from 6:1 to 8:2. We are going to look at, the opening of the seven seals of God's scroll. So here, what we can find is we can kind of understand that, these are representations of what is going to happen, mostly judgment, a picture of terror, and so on. Now, again, a lot of it is going to be how we interpret this. Um, Now, if you have noticed, what we are trying to do is understand the way how the Revelation is written and to be faithful to its genre, which is more apocalyptic in nature, and to work on the literary backdrop in a way that will be helpful for the listeners. So if you look at that manner, we can find that the church is still actively involved, unlike a lot of interpretation which says that in chapter 4, one where it says that John was taken up, and in a similar way here is the church also taken up, and hence from chapter 6 onwards the church, or after chapter 4, in the vicinity of earth the church is not there, and hence all this is not part of that sort of an imagery that we can find is not necessarily a right interpretation, though it is well accepted among so many people. Now, over here, especially in these sections from chapter 6 to 16, it primarily describes two important things. One, it talks about the suffering of God's people, the suffering of God's people, as well as God's judgment upon evil. So we can kind of get these two perspectives in a cycle, in three different cycles of sevens. So we can see in chapter 6 to 8:2, we can find the seven seals. Then 8:6 onwards, we can find the seven trumpets. And then we can find the seven bowls. So it's a pattern that is repeated, or a pattern that this is written. And each of these cycle kind of follows another pattern. Now, each of these, for example, the seals, the trumpets and balls, each of them follows a pattern where there is a first four, and then two, and then there is an interlude, which is kind of a long section, and then there is a final climatic element towards it. Now, as we look at the seven seals, you will understand what this pattern is all about. It's a writing matter, but intentionally the author has written in this way, kind of trying to make sense to the readers about some things. So keep this in mind. Chapter 6 to 16 is writing primarily focusing on the suffering of God's people, the church that is going through different sense of suffering, as well as God's judgment upon the wickedness, upon evil, upon anything that is standing against God. And it is put in a format of three cycles, which we can find as a three seals, three trumpets and three bowls. And then in these, we can find it in a pattern, which there is first four and then two, with a long interlude that comes, and finally the seventh element also appears. Now, what is important over here to understand that the visions in Revelation, especially these visions from now on, are not strictly chronological, but they are repeatedly presenting the end from different angles. So, what is happening is not one after the other, but rather it is kind of showcasing to us theological meaning. It is not following a sequence, because we can find that, even in the way how the language is used, we can find that it is primarily talking about the sense of writing, the sense of picturization of judgment from different manner. And that's where we have to understand that they are presenting this probably the similar understanding of judgment in different manner. Now, to understand these sections, obviously we need to be pretty clear with various Old Testament passages. As I was going through a few commentaries, some of the Old Testament text that kind of stands to be very clear over here. One is a passage from Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 1, verse 8 to 15, and Zechariah chapter 6, verse 1 to 8. We are going to come to that. But before that, we also can see this understanding reflecting in other writings, such as Ezekiel, especially Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 21, and so on, which primarily focuses on the explicit judgment pattern and so on. We can find sword, judgment from sword, famine, the wild beast, pestilence, or in a way, kind of summarizing about death. And those nations are practicing different forms of idolatry and sinful nature are going to be affected. They're going to be punished. And that sort of an understanding that we can see in Ezekiel chapter 14. Also, Leviticus. Leviticus talks about God telling that if Israel is going to persist, or if Israel is going to continue in the ways of, idolatry, or if they're going to rebel against God, then they are going to be in drought and famine. Wild beasts are going to attack them. They are going to be surrounded with swords and wars. And we can find that a kind of a sense where the same imagery that John is going to use in these sections are already used very well in the scriptures by the prophets and the other writers. Now, obviously, the text here, especially the first four horsemen that we can find, or the first four chariots that we can find, kind of represent the image of conquest, violence, economic hardships, and we're going to come to that. We're going to look at one by one each of the horsemen without any form of allegorization, trying to understand what this is talking about. But by looking at the text, the narrative, we kind of get a picture that this is primarily talking about conquest, violence, different type of economic hardships, and ultimately death. These were genuine threats for people in the first century, and they have remained threats for people in subsequent centuries, which is why attempts to predict the onset of the end times on the basis of these visions have consistently failed. Now, these patterns of, violence against God's people, economic hardships, and death, martyrdom, and all have been common in almost all times of history, in the history of the church. And hence, people have tried to locate these passages by saying that this is at this point of time, that passage is at that point of time, and constantly such an interpretation have kind of failed, because this is kind of talking about the story of Christian faith and Christian life. Allah, that means it is relevant to the first century people. It is relevant to today. It is relevant to people at all points of time. So what we can actually find here, it is not primarily depicting or confining its understanding to one period, but rather it's a waves of conquest, or many outbreaks and the periods of economic hardships that have occurred in the human history. And finally, ultimately, after everything, here is death that is trying to conquer it all and trying to be like the victorious one as we can see it. So, trying to theologically read it as we just did now is a better way to look at it than to say, okay, this particular passage is primarily focusing on this, and hence this is equal to that. That sort of an understanding might lead us to some form of a wrong understanding of Revelation. And hence, we should try to see how these passages are talking to our times. So let us look to the first four seals. Now, in the first four seals, the way how it is pictured is the representation. Now, this is primarily in the first 8 verses of chapter 6, the first 8 chapters of chapter 6. And over here, this is a group of 4 horsemen or chariot sent throughout the earth. Now, over here, it is very symbolic to Zechariah chapter 6, verse 1 to 7. In Zechariah chapter 6, verse 1 to 7, let me just read Zechariah chapter 6, verse 1 for all of us to understand that. It says, I looked up again, and there before me were 4 chariots coming out from between 2 mountains, mountains of bronze. And then it goes, the first chariot had red horses, the second black, the third white, and the fourth dappled, all of them powerful. So we can find that these are, coming from heaven, and it is going across to all parts and so on. So obviously, you can find this to be a very supernatural kind of imagery, not something that we will commonly expect as such. But one thing is important here. Each horseman appears as the Lamb opens a seal and represents forces released into human history. So look at verse 6 of Revelation chapter 6, verse 1. It says, I watched as the Lamb opened the first seal. Then verse 3, when the Lamb opened the second seal. Verse 5, when the Lamb opened the third seal. Verse 7, when the Lamb opened the fourth seal. So ultimately, the Lamb is in control. The Lamb is the one who is opening these seals. However, it's also important for us to see that this is a judgment. This is a destructive force that is unleashed upon the human history. And hence, it is difficult to understand or grasp the intensity of it. But the picture is pretty clear for us. So the backdrop of Zechariah chapter 6 tends to be very important to kind of understand this. The first horseman, the white horse that we can find, chapter 6, verse 1 and 2. I watched as a lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, come. I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror, bent on conquest. Now, interestingly, this is probably, I thought, one example that is there to show that the same imagery can have different representations. The same imagery, that means over here it's about the white horse or the aspect of white, can mean different things in different ways. For example, in chapter 2, we kind of get the understanding of, by the angel speaking the message to the church at Pergamum, talking about the promise of the white stone or the white garments that is mentioned in chapter 3, verse 4 and 5. So to some extent, we can kind of connect saying that, oh, this might be Jesus who's coming, because it kind of represents an image of a white horse and all of those things. Because it can also be interpreted in that way, also because we can find in chapter 19 of Revelation of a very similar imagery that a figure on a, here is a figure on a white horse, and his name is faithful and true, and the word of God, chapter 19, verse 11 and verse 13. So, some way or the other, we can kind of say that, oh, this might be Jesus upon this white horse that is coming to conquer and make everything his own. But the problem is, this first seal, the first four seals are very well interconnected. And as it is very well interconnected, it kind of, to some extent, have a similar meaning, or to some extent should be connected. So the way how the second, third, and fourth seal is put up kind of gives us a picture that this might not be necessarily Jesus who is going to come, but it is depicting a sort of a conquering person, somebody who's more in a eagerness to kind of conquer. Now, especially with the backdrop of Roman expansion, where how they were conquering one land after the other, they were kind of growing from one to the other, as we can see it. Also, at that point of time, they even feared the Parthian military threat. They kind of focused on aggressive political domination and a pursuit of power. They were constantly challenging or going after the power. We can find that the Parthian forces, they drove back into the Roman army multiple times in that decade, between 53 and 62, kind of bringing the Roman imperialism to a halt, where the Parthians were becoming a very powerful force, and they were becoming like a threat, or they were showing the limit that Rome kind of had, saying that Rome thought that they were the all-powerful ones, but here were these Parthians who were coming, and they were becoming like a very powerful force. But also, kind of get this picture that Christians also were thinking that there needs to be like a conquering spirit, a conquering understanding, or here are God's people who have to politically conquer things. Even today we have this whole Christian nationalism ideologies and all of those things, which is not necessarily the way how God's people will always act. So the first seal, as it opened, it kind of showed the picture of a conqueror, right? The conquering one, kind of summarizing or kind of showing to some extent some sense of an imperial conquest, of somebody who's coming forward and trying to win the battle, trying to grab things, conquer the things, keeping the political context also in mind. And then we have the second horseman, verse 3. It says that when the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. So the second one is obviously symbolizing people killing each other. To some extent, the picturization of war, peace to be removed from the earth. Now, this is again showcasing the aspect of how it was talking about, if the imagery is interesting, because if the first one was an imagery that came from heaven, here is somebody who's coming with the white horse, and it was trying to conquer from an outside power. But here, it was more like within themselves, the war and bloodshed within themselves, where they are trying to make people kill each other. That means this is not just external, it is basically that people were taking arms against people also. Now, there is where we can find that it's a threat of violence that is erupting within our own society, within our own community, as we can see it. So, over here, what also is interesting is it specifically says that its rider was given power to take peace from earth and to make people kill each other. Now, Rome had a system of conquering other nations. Rome had something called Pax Romana or Roman peace, where they believed that rather than always going and trying to gain by power, sometimes conquering by using peace as a measure, forming peace alliances between kingdoms were one way of doing so. Hence, they used to build roads and have trade and all these ways in which they were connected with other nations, other kingdoms, and so on, because they kind of wanted to be prosperous and they wanted to kind of flourish and did not want to have any threats. And hence, we can find that uh, eventually what happens to some extent is they thought they could protect their peace and their name and their understanding by keeping peace treaties with all other nations, but they did not recognize what they were actually doing. And also, there were martyrs on this, and we're going to look at that because there were martyrs. Like in chapter 2, verse 13, we read about Antipas and the other situations of persecution that constantly happened against Christians at that point of time. So, all this kind of shows that they used to kill people, they used to destroy people because they thought that they're trying to keep peace with the nation. They're trying to anybody who's against them, they will try to eradicate them, so that they thought they were protecting the peace. But rather, it symbolized war and bloodshed. So, conquest to war and bloodshed. The third horseman, which is what we can find in verse 5 and 6, is where we can find to be some extent of an economic aspect that we can find here, representing some element of famine or economic imbalance and so on. And what is happening here is in this, third living creature, and there was a black horse, and the black horse, the rider had a pair of scales, balance in his hand, and in this balance, we can find that a voice is coming saying 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wage and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wage, and do not damage the oil and the wine. So it is kind of giving an understanding that the economic situation is affected. You know, the wealthy are to some extent, because the wealthy can get uh, money. But here we can find that the rider is kind of showcasing the situation of high, prices to purchase the very basic necessity, right? Even the very basic matters. If a denarius was a day's wage for a laborer, then it would cost an entire day's pay to buy a little bit of wheat or barley. So what we can find is they're economically becoming very weak, they're becoming very poor. And to again challenging, because here Roman economic system, they believed that they had it all. They thought that they can never be defeated. They thought that they will never be challenged. But here we find that the crop failures and the food shortages, and it was very common for the Asia Minor places to constantly have such famines. And here, this imagery is symbolizing the limits of any economic system that is guaranteeing prosperity. We think that, okay, dollar will not fall in today's world, but it's just a matter of time. It's just a matter of it's just a matter of some time to realize that these economic things that we try to keep value eventually falls, eventually has no more value, or eventually has no more power as we can find it. So the picture or the representation here is of irregularities in commercial markets. The fourth one is to some extent what we can find in verse 5 and 6. Come, I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair, fourth one, verse 7. When the lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, Come. I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was death, and Hades was following close behind him. Now, the final rider is like a culmination of all of these put together. Here is a conqueror, war, martyrdom, and all form of economic injustice and imbalance, and all put together. Ultimately, what comes is going to be death. Ultimately, what is going to reign in people is going to be death. And the word Hades is actually, the Greek understanding saying the realm of the dead, where people who are dead are going to be there. And here, what we can find, the fourth horseman, the fourth seal, is a picture that ultimately the vulnerability of everything that we considered to be powerful. The Roman emperors thought they are powerful. The Roman emperors, from Augustus and so on, from their time when they were living, they claimed themselves to be God. But here it talks about the fourth horseman, which is saying that ultimately everything will have to conquer to death. And that's what we say. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. It representing a sense of decay. That means everything is connected to death. Everything in humanity is ultimately connected to death. It's all mortal. And that's a sort of a picture that we can find over here. So the first four horsemen and the first four seal is kind of demonstrating to us that human misuse of power is actually leading to forms of suffering and destruction. What we can clearly see here is even to from the beginning of time to even to today, these are areas where people are trying to, people, kingdoms, political parties are all trying to gain and control and so on. We can find that kingdoms are trying to conquer other kingdoms. We can find that people are trying to war against each other. And then we can see economic imbalance. People are trying to cheat each other in their commercial, business, economic matters, and so on. And ultimately, the fourth horseman representing death, ultimately, everything is going to conquer to death because we are all mortal human beings. The principal purpose of these visions in Revelation 6 is to awaken a sense of uneasiness in readers by vividly identifying threats to their well being. See, why is this written in this manner? Why is this given to the church? For them to understand that their hope should not be placed in any of this. See, all these are important. All these are essential. We need good government. We need good economic system. We need good financial planning. We need good ways of thinking and living. However, to kind of base our hope in any of this can be very dangerous. And that's why the four horsemen are designed to shatter the illusion that people can find true security in the borders of a nation or empire or in a flourishing economy or in their own health. Where do we place our trust? Where do we place our hope? Where do we place our, where do we place our things that we think that will never fail? That is ultimately what is going to fail us. And that's what we can find over here. And that's the representation that we have here. The vision reminds such readers that power ultimately belongs to God. At the same time, the visions give the oppressed incentive to persevere in the confidence that the condition that allow for the oppression will not continue forever. Now, for the oppressors, this is an end. For the oppressors, this is a punishment, judgment that is coming upon them. But for God's people who are undergoing the suffering, for them, this is a hope to know that this is not going to last forever. Even the suffering is temporal. Even the pain is temporary in nature. They don't have to suffer forever. It is a matter of temporary aspect, and it is not going to be there forever. When Zechariah heard a divine horseman report that the whole earth remained at peace, an angel demanded to know how long would God allow this condition to continue. Because ongoing peace simply gave the powerful the luxury of oppressing the people of God. For a change to come, God would need to disturb this sort of a peace. See what is happening. If you look at the Zechariah chapter 1, verse 11 and 12, and chapter 6, verse 1 to 8, where it is a very clear allusion to this, it kind of shows the picture that the powerful are getting more powerful. The oppressors are becoming more wealthier. They are becoming more powerful. But on the others, the oppressors, the ones who are being oppressed, they are, going down. They are the ones who are suffering. And here it is saying that God would disturb such a peace and God will stop such an understanding. So this first four seals represent, or it kind of showcases, the four horsemen imagery, the four chariot imagery from Zechariah chapter 6 and Zechariah chapter 1. And it also brings to us the limitedness of humanity, the limitedness of human, and the vulnerability and mortality of human lives. Now going to fifth seal, which is in verse 9 and 10. Now over here, it's again, now there is a change of picture. Now, if you remember the pattern, we have a 4 plus 2 imagery. Now look at over here. We have 4 in a way that is written where it talks about the four horsemen, kind of alluding to the Zechariah chapter 6 imagery. Now over here, then we have 2 seals. So over here, the fifth seal is a vision that is kind of shifting to an imagery of heaven. Look at that. Verse 9. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. They called out in a loud voice, How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood? So, to some extent, the fifth seal can be called as, it's the testimony. It's about the cry of the martyrs, the cry of the martyrs for justice, where martyrs are kind of asking God, people who have given up their lives for the sake of truth, because they have led a just life, because they wanted to live for justice. Here is them martyred, they have been killed, and they're crying out to God. And it says that their souls that had been slain. Why? Not because anything foolish that they did. It is because that, they, for the testimony of God, or because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained, they had been martyred. From an earthly point of view, the story of the martyrs seem to show that faith leads to suffering and loss. Isn't it? We can find that faith is ultimately over here in a way represented that if you have true faith, you're ultimately going to die. That's a sort of an imagery that we can get over here. But then we can, to some extent, get an understanding that that is not the end, or that is not the full picture. Because over here, what we can actually understand is that the picture, though it look like a loss for, yes, their lives are taken away, but then they are the ones in these judgments of God who are actually being redeemed. And chapter 7 is specifically going to look at these aspects. So over here, what we find is, look at verse 10, verse 11. It said, then each of them were given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, were killed just as they had been. So here is the whole idea, now this is not a very sadistic picture, we should not think, there should be a number attained of martyrs to happen this and so on. No, it's not that saddest picture. It's saying that this remnant is going to continue. That means the faithful ones are going to hold to the truth and who are not going to compromise to the world and who is going to hold on to what God wants is going to be there. And hence martyrdom is still going to take place. And hence they are given a white robe. That's again symbolizing that God's representation, that God's justice is going to take place. It looks delayed, but it is definitely not delayed. They are called to wait because God will ultimately act. God is going to step in. And hence, the fifth seal is the cry of the martyrs, the ones who have been killed for the sake of truth. And yes, and it says, kind of telling that indigenous. Now imagine a first century people who are kind of living underground because they are targeted by the Roman government and so on. And they are going to read this. Yes, they are They are going to understand, yeah, maybe they have to give their lives, but they are also knowing that this is a very temporary matter, knowing that this is not going to last forever, because God is going to ultimately bring justice and he is going to reign forever. The sixth seal, as we can see, it is introducing a cosmic disturbance. Now, this is where, verse 12, I watched as he opened the sixth seal. The language is changing there a little bit. And then he says, there was a great earthquake. So over here, it's to some extent like a cosmic judgment that we can find, right? The sun turned black like sackcloth made of got hair. The whole moon turned, blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth. Please understand symbolic language, imageries that is showing that especially from book of Joel, Isaiah, Haggai, and so on, showcasing a sense of prophetic warning that we can constantly find. Isaiah chapter 34, 4, Joel 2, 30, 31, all says that ultimately there is going to be the divine wrath upon the wickedness, upon the wicked people, the ones who have been living the life that is away from God. They're going to be judged, and hence there is going to be a cosmic judgment. But also, wait, there's going to be a cosmic redemption, as we can later see it. So there is a cosmic judgment that we can find over here. Now, this, interestingly, the way how this ends is very important. Verse 14, the heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. So showing that the world is not actually in the place they thought it is going to be. Verse 15 and 16 is kind of raising a very central question. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, the both slave and free, they hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. Now it is showcasing the littleness of life. The powerful might or the rich might have good houses, but they're not living in the houses anymore. They are all together hiding in caves and among the mountains. And look at what they're saying. They're saying to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it? So the whole question that is asked is, who is able to stand when the glory of God is appearing? Who is able to stand face to face with God? Who is really able to stand? People are asking the rich, poor, the powerful, the wealthy. Look at it says the generals, the princes, the prime ministers, the presidents, everybody will ask. They're saying it is better that this mountain will fall onto us and we will forever hide underneath this, that rather than coming out and facing the one who is sitting on the throne and facing the wrath of God. That kind of saying the littleness. They thought they were powerful, but ultimately they are very powerless. They don't have any position. And that is what we can see over here. Jesus, the lion lamb, Israel's Messiah, the true man, shares the worship which belongs uniquely and exclusively to the one creator God. So here we find the Lamb of God is the only worthy one. The seals are all representing that. Now, please understand, we said there is a connection, there is an imagery of 4 plus 2, then an interlude, and then the final seal. So look at here, after the sixth seal, it is not the seventh seal that is coming, but then we have a whole set of an interlude over here. It says, after this, chapter 7, verse 1, it says that I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of earth. Now, please, again, by now we are all good with our understanding on that the earth is not necessarily having this idea of corners of earth and so on, but rather it's imageries. There is no 4 corners of the earth. They're kind of showing the imagery based on their cosmic understanding of the world then. So they say, here are 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing on the land or on the sea or any tree. Now, what we can find here, he called out in a loud voice the four angels who had been given power to harm the land and sea. And then he says, verse 3, do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of God. So now, in chapter 7, we can find the redemption of God's people. See, look at all these difficult pictures that we can see across till now. And then in chapter 6, 7, we can find that God's servants are sealed for protection before the judgment is proceeding. Now, think of this as a Passover imagery, right? What was happening, right? Here is the Israelites who were waiting to go into the land that God had promised them and God wanted them to go and have. But then here is this whole incident that is taking place, a Pharaoh not leaving them. And then comes the angel of death trying to destroy the firstborn of all houses. And that is where we understand the story of Passover. The blood of the lamb is going to spare the ones whose doorpost had these blood of the lambs. And hence we can find a kind of a picture of representation that it says that those who have the seal on their foreheads, right? That means those who are truly the servants of God, those who have the seal of God upon their life, they are not going to be harmed. They are not going to be punished. They are not going to be in the wrath of God. Now, interestingly, the way how it is put, it's saying that the number of those who were sealed were 1,44,000. 1,44,000. Now, if you look at church history, this has been very crazy in its way of interpretation. Different people, especially Jehovah's Witnesses and so on, have kind of given very importance to a literal 144,000 people, saying that, these are the true number of people of God, and these are physical descendants. That means literal physical descendants of these 12 tribes are these 1,44,000 and so on. Some of you might be aware that the Pentecostal church, TPM churches, they believe that the 144,000 are their ministers, their, brothers and sisters, or their pastors who don't marry and who kind of live in their sanctuary for their lifetime and devote their life, no connection with family, no connection with them. They kind of say they are the ones and so on. This has been interpreted and misused across in different settings as we can see it. But who are this 144,000? It's a representation, right? Now look at verse 5 to 8. You can find the tribes of Israel mentioned: Judah, Reuben, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin. All these tribes are mentioned, and each of them, 12,000 each, is also mentioned. Now, what is it representing? What is it actually showcasing? It is saying that when John speaks of 12,000 being gathered from each of the 12 tribes for a total of 144,000, the number is symbolizing a sense of completeness. It's not a literal 100. It's not like they're going to take a roll number of 1 to 144,000. That is not the idea here. It's kind of symbolizing perfection. God's people are going to reign in the perfection of God. They are going to be saved in the way how God wants to be. Because the reason why we say this is, look at verse 9, because there is a multitude of people. It is not from one group. It is not just people from these tribes, but there are people of multitude. And that's where verse 9 onwards, there was a multitude that no one can count. So how did we count the 144,000? It is because from every nation, every tribe, every people, every language, there were people standing before the Lamb. And they were all wearing white robes, and they were all holding the palm branches, and they are again crying out, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. Again, they're praising the song of the Lamb. They're thanking the Lord, they're praising God, the multitude. Now, both of this are most likely referring. So the 140, the redeemed are identified as an assembly of 144,000 in 7:4 to 8 and as a great multitude in 7:9 to 17. And most likely both of this refer to the same group. We are not talking about a literal Israel over here, because this, see, the northern kingdom did not even come back. There was not even a return for the northern kingdom. The 10 tribes did not even return. We can find that after the Assyrian conquest, they did not have, they just had the southern kingdom after that. This is not a literal Israel that they are talking about. It's talking about God's people, the completedness, as we can understand over here. The redeemed are described as washing their robes in the blood of the Lamb. So, what kind of sets them apart? Not that they are now going to be people who are going to be, having the same ethnic identity as the ancient Israel or anything. That is not how they are represented as. But what is their identity now? They are all redeemed, and they are all wearing the Lamb. They are all wearing the they're all wearing the white robe, and they're all promised God's redemption. The redeemed are promised freedom from all form of hunger, thirst, and suffering, and so on. We find the reference to the Lion of Judah and the root of David, recalling the Old Testament promises concerning the Messianic King, and the vision of the slain Lamb shows that the promises are realized through the death of Christ. So we find here the Lion of Judah, the root of David, the Messianic King is here, and he is bringing these redeemed. He's bringing the truth. He's bringing the people of God. And how is it happening? It is through the death of Christ. John hears about the redeemed who come from the 12 tribes, which recalls Old Testament promises concerning God's preservation of Israel. But when he actually sees, look at this, he hears about God's protecting the people, the 144. But when he actually sees the realization of the promise, he encounters a countless multitude coming from every tribe and every nation and every people. Revelation chapter 7, 16 to 17 declares that these promises are fulfilled by the Lamb at the center of the throne, who is the shepherd that guards them from their hunger, thirst, sun, and heat, and guides them to springs of water of life. That's why the eschatological promises that the Lord will wipe away the tears of all the faces, right, is repeated over here from Isaiah 25:8, that he brings the understanding that the promise that was given, that God will truly wipe the tears of God's people, and they will now be with God. They will now enjoy the Lord forever. So see, pattern. The four seals, then the four seals represented as the four horsemen, and then the two seals. The fifth seal was talking primarily about the cry of the martyrs, and the sixth seal was talking about the cosmic judgment, the earthquake, and the chaos that is happening in the earth. And finally, the seventh seal is interesting, because seventh seal is representing a space of quietness. After all this disaster, and then in this chapter 7 of celebration, in chapter 8, the seventh seal is open, and then for about half an hour, there was silence in heaven. Again, is it a literal matter? Not necessarily. What is it actually showing, right? A kind of saying that from a very celestial praise, that's what we find in chapter 7, there is a reverential silence. Again, it is a lamb who's opening these scrolls. And to understand the true power of these, right, there is a celestial or there is a reverential silence that we can find. The silence is creating a sense of awe and anticipation. So obviously, this is going to move forward. From verse 3, again, we can see that it is now going to talk about the trumpets from verse 6. So it kind of brings the understanding that there is a sense of awe and anticipation, understanding that it is going to come. In verse 3 and 4, an angel is offering an incense with the prayers of the saints before God. We can find that they are offering a prayers before God, right? Look at verse 3 and 4. Another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all God's people on the golden altar in front of the throne. The smoke of the incense, together with prayers of God's people, went up before God from the angel's hand. So the angel cast fire from the altar onto the earth, linking prayer with the divine action. So, what's actually happening here? That means that God is valuing the prayer of the people. God is kind of valuing the way how people are praying and trusting Him and putting their hopes in Him. What can we learn from all this? Ultimately, God is sovereign over history. See, we have always thought that the ones who are powerful will always remain powerful. But these seals will tell us that is not how it's going to be. Everyone ultimately are going to be standing before this judgment of God. And hence, God is the one who is sovereign over all space of history. And ultimately, human actions carry moral consequences. What we do today, how we do today, how we live today is definitely carrying its own consequences. So, what we need to truly understand from this section and understand from this opening of the seven seals of God's scroll is to say that God is sovereign and the way how we live actually matters in God's kingdom.